I'd like to ask you to turn off the microphones and for a better connection, maybe turn off the cameras as well until we receive your questions or comments to our speakers. Let me welcome them first. But before, I would like to say we will record our event, at least the part that the speakers discuss the issue, today's theme. So just be noticed about that. So this is our third event, third online event within the framework of our Hostile Terrain 94 exhibition that will take place in Frankfurt am Main, Klapperfeld, former police prison, former Gestapo prison. The exhibition we hope to launch actually in April, as soon as the corona lockdowns will be lifted, hopefully soon. Before we received actually forensic archaeologist, anthropologist, and also artists that discussed about the border violence from different perspectives and angles. And today we receive more speakers that would be speaking more about their research and activism together and their intervention actually to the deadly borders and border policies within the context of Europe. And we will also extend our scope a bit to Turkey. So let me welcome again our speakers. I will start with Jakob Berkson, a long-term but somewhat dilettante migrant solidarity activist. Jakob Berkson became more aware, heavily involved when, along with his friends from Brighton Migrant Solidarity, he founded 1000 for 1000 in 2016. 1000 for 1000 is a project aiming to mobilize the community to provide housing for those made homeless by the UK border regime. He joined the Alarm Phone in the autumn of 2018. He wants to be part of a movement that dismantles Fortress Europe by uniting the power and the vision of those who directly confront the border by crossing it without permission, with the energies of those involved in the day-to-day grind of resisting Europe's racism. I welcome also Charles Heller, is a researcher and filmmaker whose work has a long-standing focus on the politics of migration. He's a research fellow at the Center for Research Architecture at Goldsmiths, University of London, currently based in Geneva, right, Charles? Conducting a postdoctoral research supported by the Swiss National Fund. He is the co-founder of Forensic Oceanography, a collaborative project that critically investigates the militarized border regime in the Mediterranean Sea, as well as the Watch the Med platform. So together with a wide network of NGOs, scientists, journalists, and activist groups, he has produced maps, video animations, installations, and human rights reports that attempt to document and challenge the ongoing death of migrants at sea. And he will be talking about his work as well. Natalie Gruber, welcome Natalie. She co-founded the Austrian association Cesur, which has been operating in Turkey since March 2020. Cesur supports victims of pushbacks in Turkey and is a partner organization of the Border Violence Monitoring Network, an independent watchdog network of NGOs based along the Balkan route, who monitors human rights violations at the external borders of the European Union and advocates to stop the violence exerted against people on the move. Let me also introduce our moderator, Valeria Hänsel. She's a researcher at the University of Göttingen. She takes part of the organization Border Monitoring and the network of critical migration and border research CRITNet. She has been engaged for a long time in documenting deportations and violations of migrant rights at the Aegean maritime border between Turkey and Europe, with a particular focus on Lesbos Island. I'm Pınar Şenoğuz. I'm welcoming you on behalf of the Frankfurt am Main team again, and here is the floor for you, our speakers, and Valeria.
Thank you, Pınar, and also a very warm welcome from my side. I'm very happy to see that so many people joined, and I already recognized some friends and others among them, and I'm super happy that we were able to win the three of you as discussions, and I think you will be giving us a super valuable input from very different places and also perspectives of struggles around the border. Yeah, and so I will lead us a bit through this whole event, mainly by asking questions. But before, I will give a brief, let's say an introduction of the significance of today, because today we have the 5th anniversary of the EU-Turkey deal. So 5 years ago, the European Council and the Turkish president recorded in a joint statement that they planned all new irregular migrants crossing from Turkey into the Greek islands as from 20th of March 2016 will be returned to Turkey. And this was a very crucial moment. And although we know by now very sure that they never managed to carry out the mass deportations that they were planning from the islands at all in any way, this statement, though, had quite a disastrous impact on the European migration policy, where it also came from. So since then, the Greek islands were basically transformed into open-air prisons. And these dehumanizing conditions that we see in the hotspot camps started then, in the camps such as Moria that recently burned down. It led to a systematic practice of refoulement through systematic chain deportation, so people being deported from Greece to Turkey and then on to the home countries. It created dependencies, also allowing Turkey to be blackmailing on the EU, which we will hear a bit more, I guess, from Natalie later. And also, of course, it led to systematic violent interceptions that became even worse, like an increasing number of pushbacks that we will for sure also hear about in this event. And yeah, so the EU-Turkey deal was beyond that, not only a crucial instrument for securing the external border in the Aegean, but it is somehow, in a way, that's also why I highlighted here, serving as a sort of blueprint for the reform of the common European asylum system. So what we see is that the introduction of border procedures, detention facilities at the EU external borders are outlined a lot, for example, in the new pact on migration and asylum. So it impacted the entire European migration regime, but of course it also significantly impacted the border struggles that will be the topic of today, of both migrants crossing borders and activists who adapted to these strategies. So in this panel, we get some insights from different people that are mainly a bit at the edge of activism and academia, maybe more or less, I don't know what is where you position yourself more, but so what we want to do together is look a bit into strategies that you and your organizations or groups use in the struggle for freedom of movement, and also the challenges that you probably face in this. And one other short remark, because today is not only the 5th year of EU-Turkey deal, but it's also the International Day of the Political Prisoners. And I think this is also something interesting that we can keep in mind for this. And that is crucial for our panel, because the border security goes a lot together with an increasing criminalization of both migrants and also people assisting migrants on the move. So this will be a topic coming up in the course of the roundtable. So which you want to start now with 3 different rounds of questions. And the first I would just like to mainly ask you about your own work and your activist interventions. And in the second round, I would rather try to talk with you a bit more on example cases and challenges that you're facing, and then move on a bit to the topic of criminalization and also the question on how we can create a better structures of solidarity. Yeah, so let's start, and I would just ask you to briefly, like 5, 6, 7 minutes, answer to the question I would put. So maybe we start with Natalie. Could you maybe just briefly describe a bit the work that your group is doing? And maybe you can highlight aspects like what is your motivation? How are your attempts to intervene in the European border policies? Are there certain tools that you would use? Certain corporations? Yeah, so go ahead, please.
Well, thank you very much for initiating this event and for the invitation. I'm actually here representing two different groups. So I'm here as the co-founder of JUSUR, and I'm also here as a representative of the Border Violence Monitoring Network. So first, I'm going to introduce BVMN, the Border Violence Monitoring Network, which is a self-organized network of grassroots organizations active all along the Balkan route. And together we monitor and document pushbacks and other human rights violations. And we do that by collecting testimonies and other evidence to hold the perpetrators and facilitators of border violence accountable. We do that also because of our belief in the freedom of movement and we seek safe and legal passages. Our aim in all this is to end all forms of violence and injustice from the European border regime, and also to end the criminalization of movement. And yeah, as one of the BVMN's member organizations is JUSUR. That's the organization I co-founded in Austria in 2015. And since March 2020, we have been operating in Turkey. We started providing emergency relief back in last March when thousands of people were stranded at the border, and I will talk about that more later. And what happened after that was that we witnessed increasing numbers of pushbacks to Turkey from both Greece and Bulgaria. And since then, we have been focused on providing support such as accommodation and food and organizing medical care for those people who are pushed back to Turkey. We do that with two teams, one in Aegean and one in Istanbul, and we also have partnerships with different people and organizations along the Turkish coast. And as part of BVMN, we also collect, of course, testimonies of pushbacks from Greece and Bulgaria, and we participate in advocacy work on UN, EU, and member state level. The motivation, I think my personal motivation in doing all this and my driving force has been my incapability to accept injustice, I guess. And there are, of course, many fields in which I could be working in based on this motivation. And I actually have a background in international development. But I feel like, and I've been feeling like in the last 5 years in what happened since the closure of the Balkan route and so on, that kind of, for me personally, the biggest injustice is, and the biggest hypocrisy also is, how the EU and other countries of the global north are meddling in and exploiting other countries, and thereby creating and contributing to conflict and social economic hardships and climate catastrophes and all these factors that drive people to leave their homes. And then we just close our borders on them, while we ourselves enjoy almost universal freedom of movement, before COVID at least. And so, yeah, I think that's my personal motivation. And I have this as a general feeling, but then I also have very specific moments where I'm very aware of that. So last year, for example, I spontaneously went back to Vienna from Turkey. And on a Thursday night, I just went online and booked a flight. And next day, Friday morning, I went to Istanbul, checked in at the airport, and then 3 hours later, I was in Vienna. While Kutaiba, the other co-founder of JUSUR, who is a Syrian refugee who used to live in Turkey until 2014, he made that same journey, but for him it took 6 months, thousands of euros, and a lot of hardship and suffering. And for me, it was just 3 hours and 50 euros And yeah, I don't know, that just always gives me a lot of rage that then kind of motivates me to put it into work. Because yeah, so many people are literally losing their lives, risking and losing their lives on the exact same route that I can just take on a 3-hour flight. And that's all just because of this piece of paper that we've collectively decided is needed to cross these imaginary lines we drew across our world. And I just can't really grasp that concept. And at the same time, we've also, as an international community, collectively decided and agreed on laws and said that our states should be enforcing them. And then all across Europe, from Austria, where I'm from, until Turkey, where I work, the authorities are blatantly violating the international law, the EU law, and the national law, while also humiliating, assaulting, and torturing people seeking protection in ways that I think the majority of EU citizens could not really imagine possible in Europe today, because they're just not aware of what is actually happening. Yeah, and then while all of this is happening on our borders every day, Europe still presents itself as this beacon of human rights. And I guess my personal motivation is just to end this injustice and hold Europe to its own standards.
Strong opener, thank you so much. Charles, what about you? Maybe not only also curious about your motivation, but also about the general work of the group that you're part of Forensic Oceanography. And yeah, also the way you work, maybe you can describe it a little bit.
Sure, thanks Valeria, and thanks Natalie for these inspiring words. Well, first I would say that in many ways, the aims that we pursue with the Forensic Oceanography project very much, resonate with the aims that Natalie described for border violence monitoring network. Since 2011, Lorenzo Pizzani and myself, we founded and we co-direct this project called Forensic Oceanography. And I guess what we've tried to do is really document and think through, conceptualize as well, the shifting modalities of border violence operating at the maritime frontier. Doing that has also demanded that we develop, some new methods to try and register traces, if you will, of those shifting modes of border violence. I'm just thinking that we've seen, for example, practices of non-assistance. This is very much what we started working on with the Left to Die boat case, but we've also seen veritable policies of non-assistance. For example, when the EU and Italy ended the Mare Nostrum operation, knowingly creating a lethal rescue gap at the scale of the central Mediterranean. And since 2016, what we've mostly been working on are, seeking to document and contest the articulated strategies that Italy and the EU have been deploying to seal off the central Mediterranean and beyond, i.e., on the one hand, criminalizing solidarity, and on the other, different strategies of outsourced border control. So each of those shifting modalities of border violence has demanded that we develop different tools to try and register them. In collaboration, of course, with many other actors. But beyond documenting border violence and supporting demands for accountability in the aim of blocking these forms of violence, we've also tried to contribute to forging new tools to support migrants in their freedom to move. So, for example, I'm thinking here very much of the Watch the Med alarm phone that we contributed to forge. I see many Watch the Med alarm phone activists online this evening, and let me just celebrate here. So not celebrate, that's not the right term, but rather acknowledge in the strongest possible way the tireless work that they do every day and every night in what we might think of a form of topological solidarity, i.e. activists across Europe and North Africa through a phone line become incredibly close to migrants. They are, literally through a phone line and through the sense of sound, located side by side in solidarity with migrants crossing the sea. And maybe a last word on motivation. Right now, I'm speaking from Briançon, where I'm beginning to be in dialogue with different actors to think about how we might support them in documenting and contesting border violence here as well. We're also in dialogue at present with activists in the Sahara and other areas. And I guess part of my motivation is seeing these extraordinary networks of activists, of researchers across Europe and beyond, forming this kind of not centralized, but decentralized chain of actors who seek to act to support migrants on the move and to block border violence. Border controllers like to think in terms of integrated border management that operates before, at, and after the border. I think we could think maybe of ourselves as operating some kind of form of integrated border solidarity that also operates before, at, and after the border, even though we're not coordinated in any, by any central organization that might be the equivalent of Frontex. And somehow just thinking that what I do is part of that extensive network is something that inspires me and gives me courage to continue on a day-to-day basis.
Thank you. Also very impressive. And since you already referred a lot to the alarm phone, it fits perfectly that we have Jacob here, who is more on the side of the actual, what you were mentioning, the day-to-day, night-to-night shift work of the game. So maybe you can also answer the same question for us.
Yeah, and thank you. I'm not quite sure how I meant to follow that eloquence from Charles and Natalie, but anyway, I'll do my best. So I mean, I think the alarm phone, for me, the alarm phone, and I'm speaking very personally, for me, the alarm phone has kind of two roles. One is the very direct role of trying to support people who are crossing the Mediterranean border to do so as safely as possible. But I think our other role is to bear witness to what's happening in the Mediterranean. And I think like that bearing witness like that has kind of two functions. I think when I started, I sort of thought it was in some sense in terms, and I think it is, it's true, in some sense, it's about being able to say, when the border is over, when this system is over, and I think we should remember that this is new, right? Like the deaths in the Mediterranean do not go back hundreds of years. It's not, I mean, of course they do, people have been dying in the Mediterranean, but not in the sense that the European border has been killing people by drowning them in the Mediterranean. That's not, this is a new phenomenon. And if it's a new phenomenon, it can be reversed, right? So when this is over, and it will be over, I think one thing that we will be able to say to people is, you knew this was happening. We documented it. And go to Watch the Med. There are hundreds of reports. So that's one aspect. But I think the other aspect of bearing witness for me, and this talks to my motivation, is that it's an attempt to see the world and to force others to see the world in which everybody is human. And I think fundamentally, the European border is, well, everyone knows this, the European border is racist. And part of that racism, part of the heart of European racism, I think, is to say that the only people that count, and the only people that are people even, are white people. And of course, if you're not a person, I don't have to see you. And your death is invisible to me, and your life is invisible to me. And I think what the alarm phone, one thing the alarm phone is doing is trying to see the world as the world truly is, in which there are 6 billion people in the world, and a very tiny minority of them are white. So I think that's part of what we're doing. And as Charles says, I think, well, you ask, how do we attempt to intervene in the European border? And I think that this is kind of academic jargon, and I don't like it. I don't want to be intervening in the deadly European border. It's not something I swoop in and do, right? I want to be as close as possible to people crossing. I want to be in solidarity with them, because they're not intervening in the European border, they're challenging it. And they are leading the challenge to the European border. And if I'm serious about a no borders movement, then I'm in solidarity with you. And that is my struggle too. And it's not, it can't be an intervention. It has to be something that I'm doing every day. And, the alarm phone is every day, it's 24 hours. So I guess that's, yeah, I mean, I think that's, in some sense, what the alarm phone is trying to do is to be part of a movement that is being led by the people who are directly challenging the border, and by being witness and by being in solidarity with them, and trying to make that crossing as safe as it can be. I think in some sense that the aim there is to yeah, is to challenge the border and to undo dismantle the racist structures that that maintain it, and the harms that that racism does. So yeah, I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, very well answered. Thank you. So yeah, maybe I pose you a follow-up question directly. So what I hear from you is a lot that one of the primary goals is also to really support the people in their struggle, that they're able to on their own be able to challenge the European border regime. And now I would like to focus more with you on the challenges you face in this, because of course it's a super difficult task to do in regarding how the situation has developed. And I mean, recently we all know, for example, how Italy closed its ports to rescue operation, how the Libyan Coast Guard is like not responding often to your requests, or if they are, then they are pulling back people instead of them being brought to Italy. They're super violent situations. People are brought back to situations where they really face torture. And also in other areas, like in the Aegean, for example, we see that now pushbacks have been normalized. Frontex is involved. If you call the Greek Coast Guard, then probably you are facing trouble that migrants will not be rescued but attacked. Same if they already arrived on the islands and you call the police, then probably the police will put them on a life raft and drop them again in the sea. So I mean, I guess it's making your work quite difficult. And so I wonder, how would you deal with this? What are your ideas how to deal with it? And can you maybe outline an example case or something like this, where it becomes clear the challenges and also the strategies against them?
Yeah, I mean, sure. I'll start with the example because I mean, it's probably easier to start in the concrete and move to the general. But so one case that sort of sticks in mind, we've not published it yet on Watch the Med, but we will, is 23rd of December. It's a particularly nasty case, but fairly standard. Group of people were crossing Turkey towards Lesvos. They got into distress off Lesvos, or it's possible that the Greek Coast Guard came out and intercepted them. Either way, we were contacted and told that the Greek Coast Guard had attacked the boat, stabbed the rubber, taken the petrol, sabotaged the engine, and then apparently, seemingly, this is backed up, were then just sort of toying with them by pulling this boat round and round. And then what do you do, right? So we phoned the Coast Guard, but we know the Coast Guard are attacking this boat, right, as we speak. Somehow you can't say that to the Coast Guard, but you have to kind of think, well, if I talk to the Coast Guard, well, maybe they'll be scared, right? They'll know that someone's watching them. Of course, we know, in fact, that this doesn't work. they sort of said, oh yes, there's a patrol boat in the area, we're looking, which is actually more than information that you get out of Athens usually these days. But nothing was doing. We phoned Turkey. The Turkish Coast Guard confirmed that they'd seen the Greek Coast Guard patrol boat pick this boat up. The Greek Coast Guard consistently deny that they've found this boat, and then the next day we find that the people are back in Turkey, and they've been pushed back by the Coast Guard. And I mean, I find it so frustrating. I mean, like I was saying, and to your first question, I want to support people to make that crossing. I want to support people to exercise their right to free movement, to reach Greece, right, if that's what they want to do. And I certainly don't want them to be subject to violence at the sea. And what can I do? I mean, it feels like I can do nothing, I don't just want to be a passive witness, right? I want to be an actor. So this sort of stuff makes me question the utility of what we're doing. I don't know about the rest of the network. I think it is still useful. I think that the bearing the witness is useful and important. Like I was saying before, like what else can you do when you actually see, when you see those people on the boat, when you see them as humans, then of course you bear witness. This is outrageous. This is, and I think we should all recognize this. Like I live in Brighton, it's on the seaside. Around that sort of time, there was some young kids had gone out, mucking around in a boat and got into trouble. It was front page news on the Argus, the local newspaper. The Coast Guard were out with their helicopters. Everyone was worried about the children, and of course you would be, right? Like there are children at sea, they're in distress. Like you don't want them to drown, but this is happening every day, and we don't care. And the only reason we, I mean, who's we, right? But that it's not understood in those terms is because of the color of the skin of the people crossing. So I think bearing that witness is important. But I think we need to think about. I think we need to think about our strategies, and I think we need to, as a wider no borders movement. And I guess I'll have more to say later, but what that might be. But I think we can't accept that this is normal. And I also think we need to think what it means about the European Union. I know Natalie was saying earlier, that she's disgusted that that human rights laws are violated and constantly. But I think and it is disgusting. But I think what it shows, and actually the way the law is developed, when you think about the kind of rulings that the European Court of Human Rights have made, I think particularly about the ruling at the hot deportations at the Ceuta Melilla border are acceptable. And I think some of the UK, the way the case law's gone in the UK around private and family life, human rights are extended only to European humans, right? So it's clear that at the heart of this kind of European ideal of human rights, the heart of this Enlightenment ideal, I think, is that being human is something that you become. It's not something that you're born, and you become it by being white. And I think we need to bear that in mind when we think about human rights, when we think about Europeanness. And I also think we have reasons to worry about that because it's racist, and we also have reasons to worry about it on kind of Pastor Neil Muller grounds. Like that actually in the end, that the human rights law can be, because the myth of the human rights law is it's universal, and because it cannot be applied to non-European humans, the way the case law goes, the human rights become so thin as to be meaningless. So we all lose them. And of course, we shouldn't be surprised, right? Racism is a cancer. It's destructive of anything that is good. And so I think for those reasons we need to be worried, and we need to be resisting. But just on a very practical level, I think we need to be thinking hard about how we can, like, the limitations of the tools that we're using at the moment, and how we can develop them to be a challenge to the border, because you know the moment I think the state is winning, and we need to get smart. Yeah, I'll tail off there.
Thank you. So this is actually a very good moment maybe to also bring Charles again into the game, because I always had the impression a little bit that forensic oceanography, for example, like as Jacob said, of course, the alarm phone is also bearing witness and also publishing, but the work that forensic oceanography is also doing is after a case was a super clear human rights violation, nothing could be done. Then you're trying to do intensive research on explaining how it was, finding like evidence to make it possible to do something with a case. And for example, I have in mind a case called Sea-Watch versus the Libyan Coast Guard case from 2017, where I think you were also documenting a lot on the like which vessels were used, how was it connected to EU policies, etc. And can you maybe describe or tell a bit more about this, a bit more, and also what sort of strategy is this? Like, how do you think this in-depth research and providing evidence, in fact, can affect the border situation? Like, is this sort of knowledge production that you are like quite tirelessly publishing of the violence and tracing responsibility? Do you think it really makes rights for people on the move more accessible and helps to prevent violence? It's a bit provocative, I know. And also, what are like the big challenges that you face in this field, and what sort of strategies do you follow to confront this? Like, for example, what are alliances that you work with? Yeah, maybe choose some that was questions.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Valeria. I'll try to pick some of those questions and also maybe, you know, say a few things that might resonate as well with what with the comments of Jacob and Natalie. So first, I guess, you know, in relation to our investigations, you know, each investigations spurs another set of challenges, right? I mean, first, it's about understanding what particular form of violence and possibly violation, right? Let's always recall that the law might be, I still believe that it's a useful tool, but it's also a very limited one. And the language of the law is not always able to account for the forms of violence that we're documenting. And then the question that we always have to raise, well, what traces has this form of violence left? And how might we generate or access those traces? And when we're asking those questions, I think that we're also always trying to reflect upon and position ourselves within a kind of complex field of invisibility, right? Where certain events are made hyper visible and others invisibilized, right? And one concept that we've used with and developed with Lorenzo, and it has been a bit of a political compass for us over the years, is the concept of the disobedient gaze. Very simply with that, we mean the idea that when we investigate a particular situation of violence, we're trying to reveal what states seek to conceal and not reveal what they are seeking to reveal, right? And the challenge here is that this kind of regime of invisibility, but also inaudibility, which we might think of in relation to the alarm phone, it's not static. It's constantly moving. It's also moving because migrants and activists contest it. But for example, let's take the Sea-Watch case. You know, I'm always struck when I think of the first investigations that we produced, on the left, the Diebold case, in which there was a single photograph that we could use in our investigation. In the Sea-Watch versus Libyan Coast Guard case, in fact, we had hours of audiovisual material produced by Sea-Watch, which was absolutely crucial in documenting this partly failed interception and pulled back practice that led several dozen migrants back to Libya to situations in which they were tortured. But at the same time, this footage also raised other challenging issues. We have asked in using this material, where you see we're with Sea-Watch's GoPros during a very challenging rescue operation, and we asked ourselves as well: has this footage also brought us too close to the border, too close to migrants struggling for their lives? And we're talking here also about, racialized subjects being saved by mostly white rescue activists, right? And so here, I'm also raising this to echo some of the challenges that Natalie and Jacob have raised. I think, absolutely, the border regime is very much about race. It's about class, needless to say, as well. And it uses citizenship to kind of police those categories on a global scale. And a major challenge is that when we're struggling against the violence of borders, we're often doing it from very unequal positions. And we can't simply wish away that massive inequality, right? And so we have to learn to navigate contradictions, ambivalences. And I don't think this should lead us to stop what we're doing, but to really make critique, self-critique, also an integral part of our action, to sharpen our practice and try as best we can to navigate contradictory and ambivalent positions in which at times there is no right position. There's no perfect or unproblematic position. I'm being much too long here. I'd be happy to think further maybe about the limits and the ambivalence of legal politics. Maybe we could come back to that later. But maybe one point I'd like to pick up, if I may, still very briefly, might be about, how should I say, all of us here are focusing on various border struggles, right? And, as Jacob has just, clearly highlighted for us, at times we really reach the limits of what we can do, what we can achieve at the border itself, right? And so a crucial challenge and question, strategic question, I think, as well, that we need to address is how we articulate these, again, incredibly important border struggles to support migrants on the move, block border violence. How do we articulate those border struggles with an attempt to transform the broader relations and policies within which that shape the tactical field in which we operate? How do we transform policies? How do we transform the very racial categories upon which the border is predicated? How do we transform the unequal relations between the global north and the global south, which produce and reproduce the mobility conflicts? Now you might say, well, Charles, look, you're opening up an infinite field of struggle in which we can't possibly intervene. Isn't this too big for any one of us? Well, yeah, actually it is. It's too big for any one of us. And what does that mean? That means that we need to address this with a sense of modesty. And that also means that we need to engage with alliances with various anti-racist, decolonial movements, alliances with movements for global justice and climate justice, et cetera, et cetera. So that's the way I try to think about those struggles. Yes, what we're doing is not enough, but we're offering a small part of a much broader struggle, which demand that we acknowledge the importance of these other struggles and that we enter into alliances with them.
Thank you. And to the other parts, I think we will get back later for sure, not to miss out on them. So I guess, Natalie, by now I don't even have to ask a question because you might have a lot to answer already or to add on what was said already. Although if you would be interested, because I'm super curious to hear a bit more on the land border, because I perceive the sea as the deadly area, but we know actually there's a lot of, especially this violence that's popping up a lot in the sea and now very visible. The pushbacks are like an everyday practice since forever, basically at the Evros land border, which you also have been following for a super long time. And since you're based in Istanbul, I think it's super interesting to hear from you about this area also, and maybe in particular about the escalation that happened in March 2020 when the Turkish government announced to open the borders. And yeah, I'm curious, what is your work in this context? Like, how can you operate actually in this situations where people were shooting over the border? What measures are you using? What turns out effective? And if you want to, yeah, also react on anything said before, feel free, of course.
Yes, actually, I mean, there's a lot I would love to say now, and it's sad that we have such a limited time because both Jacob and Charles raised really, really important points, I think. And yeah, I don't even know where to start now. Well, what I wanted to add to you, Charles, I think it's a really, really important point that you raised about the unequal positions we act from. And this is something that we as just also really try to counteract as much as we can. So actually half of our ground team here in Turkey are people from the community we support, who have been trying for a while, months or years, to make the same journey that the other people that we support are trying to make, and at some point gave up, and then instead joined our team and are now working with us side by side to support the people who are still trying and like the ones who get pushed back because they are not successful. So this is something we try, and I mean it's very difficult because it does require in this precarious situation we work in, both in general and in this sector, but also specifically here in Turkey, it does require quite a lot of privilege or a lot of courage and risk to be able to do that. So what I see here, for example, I mean, we are in Turkey, to add also on what Valeria, you asked now, I'm going to talk about the context last March in a bit, but continuously here in Turkey, we are in a very precarious situation. We are basically, yeah, at the goodwill of the Turkish government, and it's quite unpredictable how long we are able to do what we are doing. It's changing continuously. We know that we were surveilled for a long time. It's, yeah, so, and for me, as an Austrian citizen, with the ability to just leave the country within a couple of hours, that's not a big deal. Like, I mean, I can, yeah, if I get expelled from Turkey, so what, you know, then I just continue somewhere else. But for other colleagues, for example, from Libya, who do not have that option, who cannot just return because they are persecuted there and they cannot just go. If they get in trouble here in Turkey, there's really no other option for them. So that's a huge problem in all this. Anyways, to your actual questions now on the land pushbacks. Yeah, I think I'm really grateful that you've included that in this discussion, because it often gets overlooked in the media. And I think a big part of that is just that lack of footage also. But yeah, they have been happening for a long time. As you said, they've been happening for decades actually. But they have become more and more systematic since the supposed closure of the Balkan route. And then especially last year, they reached an unprecedented scale, both in numbers and tactics and brutality. And part of that was the escalation between Turkey and the EU, but not only, because it did not only escalate between Greece and Turkey, it escalated all along the Balkan route on all our land borders. Also, I'm not sure how, like, to the very basics I should go now, because I'm not sure how aware the audience here is, but I'm just going to mention that pushbacks across land borders are incredibly brutal. torture and inhumane and degrading treatment are the routine, basically. So with BBMN, you know, we collect testimonies and we evidence what's happening all along the Balkan route. And last year, 85% of all the pushback cases that we recorded included one or more forms of violence. On the Greek and Croatian borders, it was actually even more than 90% of cases that included violence. And this violence is very indiscriminate. More than 1/3 of the pushback cases that we recorded in the whole region included minors. And specifically on the Greek-Turkish border, it was more than half of the cases that included minors. Yeah, so, and minors, I mean, that could be 17-year-olds who soon turn 18, but very often it's much younger, and it's including also toddlers and babies. And also they are not only, pushbacks on the land borders are not only occurring on the external borders of Europe, such as Greece, Bulgaria, and Croatia, but they are routinely conducted from countries such as Austria and Italy, and then throughout Slovenia and Croatia and so on, and then all along the Western Balkans as well. So this is a very widespread practice, and seems to be expanding, actually. And a good example of what that means, especially this chain pushback thing that I mentioned, is what that means in reality is, for example, this young Afghan man I met last year here in Turkey, who had experienced a total of 32 pushbacks within 6 months and had actually reached Slovenia 5 times before being pushed back all the way to Turkey. And he made that journey until Slovenia with his best friend, but that best friend did not return to Turkey because he died in North Macedonia at the age of 22. So this is the reality, and it's not just the Greek-Turkish border. Of course, it's huge here also, but it's basically everywhere. And yeah, regarding the events last March, that's a very complex topic that would require a whole discussion by itself, I think, to go into the depths of what happened there and why. But the background is, of course, the EU-Turkey deal that we mentioned that was agreed upon 5 years ago today. And then that there have for years have been a lot of conflict around the implementation and the continuation of the deal. And then this conflict escalated at the end of February last year when the Turkish government announced that the borders to Europe were open for refugees. And following that announcement, many people on the move went to the border thinking that they would be able to make it to Greece. But that's not the whole story, because what also happened is that the Turkish government forced many people to the border against their will. Greece, of course, reacted by sealing off the border completely, deploying additional police and military to the border, and also by suspending its asylum system. And the EU then praised Greece for being its shield and defending the union and so on. So again, like I just don't like to paint Greece as the main perpetrator here, because it is all on behalf of the EU and it's the wider system behind it. But yeah. And then, yeah, throughout March, thousands of people were stranded at the border between Greece and Turkey, at the land border. There were various numbers circulated on how many exactly. Our own team, we estimated it to be around 20,000 people mid-March. And for 1 month, all of these people were stranded in sort of a wild camp. So that was just some tarps and sticks, improvised tents in the mud and cold. The Turkish authorities did distribute some food, but by far not enough for everyone. There were hardly any sanitary facilities and basically no medical care. And the violence was constantly escalating. Several people were shot from the Greek side. At least 2 died also, as forensic architecture was able to evidence. And yeah, this escalation was also the start of CET operating in Turkey. So we sent a team to the border to distribute food and other basic necessities. And operating there was incredibly difficult, both because of the violence from the Greek side, which meant that there was tear gas everywhere, 24/7, frequent shooting, people panicking because of that. But it was also very difficult because the Turkish authorities did not want us there. We had to distribute aid like drug dealers, basically, like from the back of our car, hidden, constantly being checked by undercover police, and then often also told to stop doing that. So yeah, it was not easy, but it was possible. I just always like to point out that what happened last March on this very public stage has actually continued since then with much less attention, because human lives are still being abused and put at risk and instrumentalized in the political conflict between Turkey and the European Union, and particularly Greece, of course. Until today, Turkish authorities encourage crossings to Greece. Greek authorities push as many people back as they can every single day. When Turkish forces then witness these pushbacks, they try to prevent them. And if they find people back on the Turkish side after a pushback from Greece, they force them back to Greek territory. That's a new development we've seen in the last half a year. That it has been happening from time to time before, but in the last half a year, it's almost every case. So what happens is then people end up getting pushed back and forth between Turkey and Greece several times, or they end up getting stranded on islands in the Evros River for days. Yeah, so it's getting worse. And basically this whole situation only exists because of all the issues that Jacob and Charles already mentioned. And particularly, I think also a symptom of all these issues is specifically the EU-Turkey deal, with which refugees are clearly treated as a problem to get rid of through externalization instead of people with rights enshrined in international law. And just as the deals with Libya and all the other externalization, this deal should never have been signed in the first place.
Thank you. So now you did manage to cover a lot of topics. That's great. Yeah, now we have many open strands, but I think for the last round, it would be interesting if you could try to focus again on this issue on criminalization and pressure that activists on the borders face, including, of course, migrants, who are like the most people struggling the hardest at the borders. And also maybe about what you already started to talk regarding structures of solidarity that can possibly challenge the European border regime in a way. And you were already all referring to the issues of being somehow unequal in your work, because you have very different protections regarding the passport, the statuses of people. But how is it possible to still somehow collaborate and work together against these structures? And what do you think could be like a future, or like, to put it positively, like a future idea maybe to collaborate better among more actors on a different way? So before the border, on the border, and after the border, as you put it already, Charles. Yeah, and of course you can also pick up other parts of the conversation that were already started. So anybody up to start?
I'd be happy to pick up on the criminalization, but I mean, I don't know.
Yeah, sounds good.
So the background here is that Chausseur has, and Alarm Phone and other NGOs together have been mentioned in relation to a criminal investigation in Greece since last September on the charges of espionage, violation of state secrets, facilitation of illegal entry, and yeah, I'm not going to comment much on that. I would just rather talk about criminalization in general, because this is something that I think everybody in this field is aware of, is part of the work basically by now. And it's something that we also as Chausseur have expected from the start. We just didn't think it would happen this quickly. But yeah, so also in the first few months of operating at the EU-Turkey border, we've had many discussions among our team preparing for something like that. And it's like, you could ask, is it normal to discuss who is willing to go to prison, even though all your work is in line with the law? And it's not normal, of course it's not, and it should never be, but it has been the climate that activists in this field have been operating in for years all over Europe. And you just have to take that into account, but you can't let it stop your work basically. And as a side note, also personally, I think no matter how much you prepare, it's still a shock when it actually happens to you. And it did for us also affect both of our work and the mental health of our team members. But, and I personally also still don't really know how to deal with it, but it's just part of our life now. And it's just so common that it's not a surprise even. And it's not just Greece, because I mentioned that, but again, it's not just Greece. It's happening all over Europe, and it's happening on behalf of the European Union. If you look at BVMN, almost half of our member organizations are currently facing criminalization, including in Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia, Serbia, and Greece. And that includes formal criminalization, like in our case, but it also includes informal criminalization. It includes scrutiny, obstruction of individuals and organizations. It includes verbal and physical violence. It often includes smear campaigns and defamation in the media, which make support work more difficult and more dangerous. And I mean that there are like all these statements by politicians and all the media reports that associate civil society organizations with people smugglers or scapegoat them for the presence of people on the move and depict humanitarian assistance as a pull factor. And this negative narrative stigmatizes, delegitimizes, and criminalizes both the people on the move and the supporters. And of course, also fuels and legitimizes threats and violent attacks against people on the move and human rights defenders. If I want to go a bit more specific, our Croatian partner organizations, for example, have experienced in the last 5-6 years already death threats, physical attacks, arrests, arbitrary detention, including aggressive interrogations and intimidation. And after all this, the police even went to the very personal level when they tried to recruit the boyfriend of one of their team members as an informant and threatened to revoke his refugee status if he refused. He refused, and they actually followed through with it and revoked his status. And yeah, so BVMN also recently published a report on all of this general criminalization, which is called Shrinking Spaces, because that's exactly what the result is of this criminalization. It's shrinking the space for civil society to act, and it jeopardizes the rights of citizens to assist those in need of humanitarian aid. And all that is a key function of democracy, which is at high risk at the moment. And because you also asked about strategies to deal with this challenge, I think like for us, Chausseur, the clearest strategy we have is that we only, from the beginning on, we decided to only have one public face representing Chausseur, which is me for now, to keep all the other team members anonymous so that we don't risk our operations and individual safety. And that strategy worked very well so far. Other BVMN partner organizations have taken preemptive measures. For example, some of them decided to contribute to the network only as anonymous partners, to not risk their actual operations on the ground because they are contributing to the network. Within BVMN, we've had to expand the scope of our work to address the challenge of criminalization. So as a network, we've started creating reports about the topic. We've started working on a toolkit to deal with criminalization. And it's basically just become like a normal aspect of our work, another to-do we have to think of. And it really shouldn't be that. But yeah, but in general, I think there's no effective way of dealing with criminalization because it's very fast moving. Like as soon as a new strategy starts, we take steps to address it, we develop the resources, and then suddenly we're hit with the next strategy, which we then again have to find new ways to deal with. But there are great alliances in this common struggle. And we've experienced so much solidarity since our criminalization, and I'm incredibly grateful for that. And a lot of support was offered from different civil society organizations. So yeah, I think there are great alliances there. But again, when we think about how to address and hopefully eventually solve the actual problem, we have to address the underlying issue, and that is that migration has increasingly been framed as a security issue, which leads to fortification, militarization of the borders, and then of course also of criminalization of people on the move. And it's only because movement is criminalized that we experience all this criminalization of solidarity. So the way to go would be to address the root cause, not the symptoms. So to end the criminalization of solidarity, we have to end the criminalization of movement.
That's a strong ending point, yeah. So who wants to react on this or add something? Charles? Your mic is off.
Thanks. Sorry about that. Yeah, I was saying that there's a lot on the table now, and it's hard to think of which threads to pick up. But maybe I'd like to really try to locate the criminalization of migrants and solidarity in relation to that hinge moment of the EU-Turkey deal, right? It seems to me that if the long summer of migration of 2015 really constituted the peak in migrants' struggle for freedom of movements, their capacity to overcome European borders in that sequence that was opened by the Arab uprisings and the reopening of the Mediterranean frontier. So if the long summer of migration is somehow the peak of that capacity, well, as you've just mentioned in far more detail, it's immediately followed by a kind of rollback of the border regime, a desperate attempt by European states to reimpose order onto migration and borders. And I think, essentially what we've seen is that the EU and its member states realized that they were utterly unable to respond to the presence of migrants on European soil, right? As soon as the frail bodies of migrants arrive on European territory, they generate a massive political crisis. Now, let's just keep that in mind, that these frail bodies, these dispossessed and racialized bodies have, when you think about it, an extraordinary political power, right? The simple presence of their bodies generates crisis for some of the most powerful states in the world. And I think realizing that, the EU and its member states, essentially decided that the only solution was to prevent migrants from ever arriving at all at any cost, right? By re-implementing various forms of outsourcing of border control. And as part of that, everywhere that we can think of, I think, criminalization of solidarity has been an inextricable part of the hardening of borders, of the re-outsourcing of border control, right? So it's maybe too easy for me to say. I personally have not been criminalized so far. I touch on wood, and I really admire the courage that Natalie has just demonstrated, and the courage of countless organizations. I'm thinking, for example, of the Juventa crew, with which I've worked to try and support them through counter investigations. So it must be, I can only imagine how incredibly challenging it must be to be criminalized in this way. But I'd like to try to foreground that if non-governmental actors are being criminalized, it's because they're effective. It's because the EU cannot impose the rollback of the border regime, the re-outsourcing of borders, without getting us out of the way, right? So as, it might be, paradoxical, to think in this way at the time when, non-governmental actors are really taking a beating. But actually, if they're being attacked in this way, it's because their action is strong, because they are effective. And thus, I can only encourage all actors who are being criminalized to stay strong. And then I think, in dealing with this, several organizations, again, I'm thinking of Juventa, but I'm sure there would be many others to mention, have been also quite exemplary in underlining, that they might be victims of criminalization, but that migrants are criminalized on a daily basis, that Tunisian fishermen are criminalized as well, that beyond the borders of Europe, we're seeing not only the criminalization of solidarity, but really the criminalization of sociality itself, i.e. renting an apartment in Niger, say, becomes an act that can be increasingly criminalized, right? So I think that European NGOs who have managed to attract attention to their cause, they've been the most effective when they've both tried to push back against the criminalization they are a victim of, and try to use the light that their situation is generating and redirect it as well on much less documented situations. Maybe last, I want to quote a text that I'm reading often these days. Paul Gilroy is a thinker that I often return to, whose thinking I think is incredibly powerful. Maybe it comes back to the issue of how we deal with our unequal positions, and clearly we need to address them. We need to try and undermine those that inequality. But also, I think, once we're aware of it, we can try to use it in an effective way. This is what Paul Gilroy writes. Where the lives of natives, prisoners, and enemies are abject and vulnerable, they must be shielded by others endowed with more prestigious, right-bearing bodies that can inhibit the brutal exercise of colonial governance, right? So how can we acknowledge our unequal positions, but also try to use them in effective ways? And I think that's also what Paul Gilroy is pointing to, what Natalie somehow has described with the strategy of her own organization.
Super interesting thought.
Yes.
So, Jacob, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, I'll try and be quick because Natalie and Charles have said many things. I don't know if there will be time, but I would like at some point Charles to talk about why he uses bodies here. I always find that this terminology really interesting and challenging and odd, and I've never seen a reason given. Why am I not a frail person? Why am I a frail body? Why am I not a racialized person? But yeah, I mean,
maybe you can, because it's an interesting thing, and I think it can be shortly discussed. So maybe you can answer on this, Charles.
I haven't even given such a clear thought about that. I'd like to think about it further. Yeah, it's true. I think I spoke of frail bodies, and in fact, conversely, Gilroy, in the quote I just mentioned, rather speaks about right-bearing bodies. So, I would not necessarily think about, the term bodies applying only for negatively racialized and disempowered subjects, right? But again, I think it's a very good question that you're raising, and I'd like to think further about it. And if it's a term that, yeah, I just leave it at that, in fact.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think it's my very anti-materialist philosophy of mind, philosophy of personhood coming through, but it makes me wonder, what are you saying body say? Natalie and Charles obviously have said almost everything I want to say. I mean, I would point out, I think one of the things that's interesting is when we think about criminalization, and when you ask this question, I think we think about it in terms of kind of European activist networks. One of the things I guess is true of Border Violence Monitoring Network and of the Alarm Phone is they're transnational networks, right? And Charles is working transnationally too, right, with forensic oceanography, and the people that are being criminalized fundamentally in the network are our members on the far side, the non-European side of the European border, and how to put it. And they're not just being criminalized, right? The law doesn't apply, right? The European, the border space is a space where law does not apply. The point, one of the fundamental problems with the border, I think, is that the law is claiming power on the far side of the border and not offering you its protection. And in that space, and in that sense, the law is nothing other than violent. For me, that is actually the fundamental legal, ethical, philosophical problem with borders, right? You have to have a law that applies on both sides of the border and will not protect those on the far side. And so it's nothing but violence. And for that reason has to stop. The borders have to, at the very least, be open. So yeah, it's our members who are on the far side of the border who are exposed, even just criminalization, just to brutal violence. You know, their heads are kicked in, their houses are raided, they're subject to arbitrary, detention, deportation, you name it. And then again, like, who is being criminalized? Who are the activists that are being criminalized for challenging the border? They're people driving the boats. We're seeing this a lot, right? They're the El Hiblu 3 we've not mentioned. And yet, when we talk about criminalization, we talk about the Juventa, and rightly, because they need our support and our solidarity, and we talk about Mediterranean. And we do talk about the El Hiblu 3, but nothing like enough, right? And nothing like enough that we're talking about the fishermen that are being criminalized for the work that they're doing, and the people being accused of people smuggling simply because, you know, they've been the ones brave enough to hold the outboard motor. So I think you know, we also need to do away with the whole notion of a people smuggler. I mean, like, you know, it's bullshit. So yeah, but I also think, you know, we, just in terms of sort of moving forward, I think, and you know, what we can do, we need to be anti-constitutional. I think it seems to me that, and in that sense, revolutionary. It seems to me that sometimes I think that this is wrong, but often I think but usually I think it's right, and that is that the border and the maintenance of the border is fundamental to Europe. It's fun, and because racism is fundamental to Europe. And I think I sort of, in some sense, perhaps disagree with Charles that we need to think about class as well. I think we do, because I think we can't understand racism without understanding class. I think we have to understand particularly anti-Black racism in terms of, it's not about race. It's not about in the sense of ethnicity. Capitalism is a system, I think, that says the world is run by and for the owners of capital, and that is racialized and has been racialized since its inception in colonialism and in slavery. So fundamentally, the people who are to be kept out of property, to be kept out of control, are people who are racialized as Black. That's fun, and that's, of course, that's class, right? That's, you know, fundamentally the working class is Black. But I think you know, for me, it's sort of unhelpful to think about that in terms of class. So I think that part of the border is fundamental. That aspect of racism is fundamental to the European border. And I think the other aspect of racism that's fundamental to the European border, which applies more broadly, I think, is the kind of racism that you see anti-Semitism being an example of, right? In that it's about control. Who is allowed into Europe? Who is allowed to be a European? And maintaining that control, maintaining that distinction between those people that can join the golf club. I saw somewhere nice, actually, we shouldn't talk about the global north, but golf playing nations. If you look at the global distribution of golf courses, right? They match rather nicely on to what we call the global north. But you know, but of course, you know, at least in the UK context, those, you know, you're not allowed to join the golf club if you're a Muslim, or you're a Jew, or you're an African, right? That's not allowed. And it's that level of control as well that I think the border has, and we have to be against that. And I actually think we need, just to, because I'm feeling grumpy and controversial, I think, you know, one of the problems that we have is we have these conversations in the auspices of the university and under the auspices of Der Spiegel or the Guardian, and that can't be anti-constitutional. They are part of the establishment, however radical the academic is. So I think we need, if we're going to be serious about the movement against the border, it needs to start from direct action. And as Charles rightly pointed out, this is in our lifetime. This is not even in our lifetime. This is in the last 5 years. The border fell. It is doable, right? The border is weak. And as Charles rightly pointed out, the presence of people in Europe was enough to generate a political movement against it. But the question is, how do we harness that political movement? And I think we need to be clear that we are anti-constitutional, that we are a revolutionary movement. And in that sense, we need to be generating knowledge for ourselves and disseminating that knowledge as part of organizing, I think, and to be led by a direct action against the border and challenge the border. And of course, that's going to involve being criminalized because it's revolutionary. And the law is not our friend, right? The law is against us. So we have to be ready for it. Anyway, there's enough ranting from me.
Well, I would actually love to continue this discussion with all of you on limits of law and revolutionary practices. The problem is that we are coming to the end of our time, but we still have some time to open towards everybody who is here to pose some questions. So in actual fact, we were planning at one point to be done with this talk in 5 minutes. However, I think if people still feel like being able to stay, then maybe we can also prolong it a little, that there's some, yeah, if you have to leave, you can also, of course, leave anytime. And then we can see if there's any questions coming up. So maybe to everybody who is in here, you could just either write them in the chat or you